Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UnX News Radio podcast, your news source for all things unexplained. And now, here's your host for the UnX News podcast, Margie K.
Hello and welcome to UnX News. I'm your host, Margie K, and we are live today on May 7th, 2021. If you have any questions during the program, please put them in the comment section and we'll see that, and Peter can answer questions for you. And as always, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, UnX News, so that you get updates about things that are coming up and shows that are coming up. I have a very special guest this evening, all the way from New Zealand, and here we have perfect reception. Peter Hassall is a stunt performer, a fight choreographer. He does prop weapons rentals, and he is a writer and researcher, and he wrote a book called The NZ Files. So we're going to talk about that tonight, and the strange goings on in New Zealand with UFOs. Welcome to the program, Peter.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks so much. We've been talking a little bit, and I think some of what you're doing is extremely interesting. I'd like to start with, how did you get interested in this subject?
Okay, so I'm getting pretty old now. I was born in 1960, so I've hit 60. In the early to mid 1970s, there are a lot of popular paperbacks came out about UFOs and Fortean phenomena, named after Charles Fort. They reprinted his 4 books. Also, the Bermuda Triangle, all that sort of stuff. And I was very interested in particular UFOs especially, but also things like the Loch Ness Monster, Bermuda Triangle, etc. So I sort of devoured all those paperbacks, and at the same time I started collecting newspaper clippings, if there are any articles about UFOs or other unexplained Fortean events in the paper. 1973, there was a big wave of UFO sightings in America, and I turned 13 that year, and that sort of really piqued my interest. And then a bit later on in the 70s, we had Close Encounters movie, of course, with J. Allen Hynek was a consultant on that, and of course it was based on his classification system. And then towards the end of the decade, we had the Kaikoura UFO sightings in New Zealand, which is a famous series of sightings by pilots and also a TV news crew who went on a flight after the initial sightings and filmed it. And that made international headlines at the time. So all that, in the 1970s, there was a lot going on.
Did you ever see a UFO yourself?
I've never seen something which I would consider completely unexplained. I've seen the odd light in the sky, which, one night traveling steadily across the sky and it just disappeared. And that could have been explained by a satellite, catching the sunlight and then going out of where the sun was, things like that. My father, though, who is no longer with us, but many years ago, although he was very skeptical about UFOs, he had a sighting of an odd lighted object in the sky at night, which he was certain was not an aircraft. But no, I would partly love to see something really close up and which cannot be conventionally explained, but then part of me would also not want to, because I get the feeling, because of my big interest in the subject and writing, no one would believe me. And I honestly, if I did see something, I wouldn't tell other people other than my wife and my son.
Really?
Yeah, I think I would just get too much. And you see this happen with just people who aren't interested in the subject. Sometimes they can get ridiculed and harassed quite a lot. And that's whether you've seen a ghost or a monster or a cryptid, or as well as UFOs, anything unexplained. People can sometimes get really harassed and ridiculed.
Well, as of late, especially the last few months, the Navy and the Pentagon have come out and admitted about that these things are real and they don't know what they are. And then we have a big file dump that's coming in June. So, and I think there's been a lot more public talk about it, a lot more media coverage, and taking it very seriously. For me, in the US at least, I think people are taking a little bit different attitude towards it and are not so skeptical anymore. Are you finding that to be true in New Zealand?
To a degree, what I think is interesting is that governments worldwide have investigated UFOs. And over the last decade or so, a lot of those governments have, you know, publicly released all their files on UFOs. So it's been quite an eye-opener how much interest governments have actually had. And also it's quite interesting, as you say, of the recent pilot sightings and videos and the Navy ones, um, you know, they were all leaked. They weren't publicly released by the military, the Air Force or the Navy or whatever, but they were actually leaked by people. And then they've been forced to confirm, yes, this was actually filmed by our personnel, and no, we don't know what it was. Same with those multiple, they're calling them sort of drone-like objects near the ships in
Hmm.
2019. Um, so you do wonder what else are they still sitting on, and we do have an example of that in New Zealand that's ongoing.
Yes, yes, and we'll discuss that. I'd like to just kind of go back in time for a minute because you studied the 1909 airship sightings in New Zealand and what is that? Aotearoa? How do you pronounce that?
Aotearoa, so that's
Okay.
the Maori name for New Zealand. So many people are taking it up because New Zealand's actually means New Holland, which comes from Dutch, of course, Zealand.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
and it's kind of a bit colonial.
I see. I see. I totally understand that. Um, I was interested in the like 1897 to 1915 sightings. So I studied that a little bit. I put that in my book, The Kansas City UFO Flaps, because we had some in Kansas City as well. I really only concentrated on the sightings in the United States, which I find were quite fascinating, very, very strange accounts. So I'd love to hear about what happened in New Zealand.
Yep. So in America, of course, the main wave was 1897, though there was a smaller wave in 1896. And also there were waves in around 1912 to 1914 in Europe, England, South Africa, and places like that. But as you say, in 1909 in New Zealand, it was discovered quite a while ago now that there were multiple reports of mystery airships in New Zealand. And the sightings tended to run from the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand up through that and up through the North Island to sort of near the top of the North Island, so heading south to north generally. And then shortly after that, when the sightings ceased in New Zealand, there were sightings in Australia, which is about 4 hours flight east of New Zealand. Um, so that's all rather interesting, and the reports were often of strange lights and apparently lights on a dark cigar-shaped object at night. Um, there were some interesting daytime sightings as well. Generally speaking, they're very similar to the American, Canadian, and reports in other countries of mystery airships. Um, what I think is interesting is it seems to be like a matter of interpretation. People were reporting roughly similar things to what many people see now, but they were calling them airships. The same as in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. There were lots of reports of mystery planes, but they were essentially the same things, lights on some object at night. Um, back in 1909, they had a couple of ideas about what these airships might be. The two key ones were they thought it was a secret inventor or inventors flying them around. Um, and another one was that they were German spy aircraft being flown from a ship somewhere off the coast. And that kind of ties in, especially the secret inventor one, with what was fought in America in 1897. There was a smaller group of people who believed that it was Martians, but generally people were thinking secret inventor or German spies, both of which don't stack up at all in any country as an explanation for those sightings.
Did you have any witnesses speak to the occupants of these craft at that time?
There were just a couple of cases where people claimed that, and again in America there were reports like that. So, I mean, it's hard to tell at this stage. My gut feeling is that they are most likely hoaxes, because in some cases people claim that the people spoke in German accents or foreign languages and things, and I'm a bit suspicious of that. And also, simply is not a sensible explanation that they were spies or secret inventors flying airships around at that time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the location of one of the famous daylight sightings. So it's not a good quality one. It's from an online newspaper archive, but it's just a rural area with only a few houses. And then that was seen by a group of school children who had gone home for lunch before they returned to school, but also several adults at the same time. And they all drew roughly similar sketches of a cigar-shaped airship object with sort of wing-like things on it. The explanation put forward at the time was that they'd all seen a flock of birds flying around, which I don't think fits the facts in that particular case.
Okay. And what is this picture?
Yep, so that's just taken a couple of days later. So that's some of the adults that saw it with some of the children, not all the children. Again, it's not great quality. And that is a typical cartoon of the time about the airship sightings, with various sort of funny captions about explanations and things. You'll notice in one of the sketches there, it's directing a beam of light towards the ground, which was another fairly commonly reported feature in all these early airship sightings, and indeed in many modern UFO sightings as well.
Yeah, it does sound like the more modern sightings with a beam coming down to the ground. I know we had, at least in one case, the witnesses saw people attached to a cord come out of the airship and look like they were floating in water. And I thought that was, and they were like moving their arms like they were swimming, but they were in the air. That one was just bizarre. It's hard to believe that anybody could come up with a hoax like that, because that idea seems so strange. Did anybody report anything like that?
Not of. There were a couple of reports of people or witnesses who said they saw people in the airship, but not that type of thing as you said.
Yeah.
One interesting thing too is, of course, the general public are usually completely in the dark about all this early stuff. People usually think it all started in 1947 when things really kicked off with Kenneth Arnold's sighting, June 24th, I think, near Mount Rainier. And then there were lots of UFO reports after that, and it's never really stopped since, with sort of some years like 1952, 1973, etc., having huge peaks of sightings. But there is this huge mass of reports pre-1947 going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And one great thing about the internet and modern technology is there are many, many newspapers now which have been digitized and put online.
Yes.
We have a site just for New Zealand ones called Papers Past. And if people just Google Papers Past and quotes, they'll come to it. And there's an Australian one called Trove, as in like treasure trove, Trove. And there are some, and they're both free, by the way, which is great. And there are also some pay sites which are fairly reasonable. There's one for British newspapers and one for American newspapers, but also many little regional American newspapers or Californian papers or whatever will have their own specific site. And through researching into all these, people have discovered a huge amount of reports which nobody knew about previously, including many more reports of the airships and all these waves.
Exactly. And I've found in doing research the last several years that more and more newspapers are coming online all the time
Mm.
because I've been anxiously waiting for a couple and they suddenly popped up. So it does take a while to get everything scanned and get it in, but it's a huge information bank at these newspaper sites. You know, in the 1973, we had that huge UFO wave in United States. Did you have any waves like that in New Zealand?
No, well, we've have had waves in New Zealand, usually regional ones in one particular town or area. But the 1973 one was specific to America. I don't think it was really in any other countries at the time. Occasionally
Okay.
there's been a worldwide wave, but often waves will tend to be more regional. And you have this whole idea of flaps of sightings of things potentially happening in what's often called window areas. Um, so the whole Mothman thing is kind of an example of that, where you not only have Mothman reports, but UFO reports and even some ghost poltergeist type stuff going on. And it's interesting to me that often, not always, but often you can get one area where a range of these different types of phenomena are going on at the same time. And if people are just researching UFOs, they may miss the related Bigfoot sightings that are going on in the same
Exactly.
area at the same time, and vice versa. Um, because I'm sort of a 410, so I'm interested in UFOs, monster entity reports, ghost poltergeists, and other stuff as well. Um, not to bang our own drum, but 410s tend to pick up on that perhaps a little more than someone who's just a UFO researcher or just a Bigfoot researcher or just a ghost researcher or whatever.
That's 100% true. In my opinion, you do have to know a little bit, at least a little bit, or a lot about all of these subjects, and then you find there are these connections. One of the things that you mentioned was the Mothman, and I have an interest in winged creatures. In fact, just wrote a book about it, but also I have a map, a Google map that is worldwide and it's just for winged creatures. So I'd like to, you know, get as much information as I can about that. The I have found a connection with UFOs and winged creatures. What is your thought about that?
I think there's something perhaps going on there. My interest was peaked, funnily enough, I think it was also 1973. I used to buy copies of Fate magazine when it came out here in New Zealand. And I've got a fairly complete collection now from the very first issue, 1949, right through to about 1978. I've got virtually every issue. But in 1973, there's an article called Winged Weirdies. I think Jerome Clark wrote it or co-wrote it, perhaps with Lauren Coleman. And they covered things like giant reports of giant birds, but also there are some intriguing reports of flying entities like guys with jetpacks or people with what appeared to be either natural or mechanical wings. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. But you know that's gone right through from the 1940s to the current day. For instance, just recently there have been a couple of sightings and one video of someone apparently flying a jetpack near LAX in Los Angeles. And he was filmed flying out to sea off the coast, um, sort of way too high to be a known sort of jetpack thing, as well as being extremely dangerous in that airspace.
Mm-hmm.
There's some speculation that it's a drone shaped like a person with a jetpack, um, but it's still a little odd because it's flying out to sea. There's nothing anywhere near it. You could be controlling it. And again, it's the capabilities of a range and the height and all that sort of thing. Um, so that's quite
Yeah.
curious. I did write an article a few years ago for 14 Times magazine where I sort of combine cases of stuff like that and futuristic car type vehicles and things of that nature, and sort of speculatively said, this is kind of like if they were time travelers, whatever, or people getting glimpses of the future or whatever, um, which is obviously an out there idea, but it's just
Not
sort of
so
a
much. it's
it's just very
it's more
interesting.
believable now. What about have there been any Mothman sightings?
Not in New Zealand. There's only been a couple of sightings of giant bird type creatures in New Zealand. We used to have an extinct eagle called the Hassall eagle, which is very large. So we're sort of evocative of that. We've had a lot more sightings of things like moas, which are supposed to have died out 500 or 600 years ago. Believe it or not, we've even had a couple of Bigfoot type sightings in New Zealand, or more than a couple. It's called the hairy mohow.
Hmm.
Mohow is a Maori name for it, and there are a couple of very interesting reports of that associated with balls of light at the same time.
Oh,
So,
I had several of those cases. Balls of
an
light
Australian,
with Bigfoot.
an Australian researcher I know called Tony Healy. He's primarily interested in reports of big cats and yowie or Bigfoot type creatures and so on. He's been over here and he got onto those two cases about the Bigfoot type creatures seen with balls of light associated. And we have many, many sightings, especially in the South Island of New Zealand, of big cats. And
Hmm.
they are certainly not native to New Zealand. We don't have anything big and dangerous, or even small and dangerous. Really, we don't have, we don't have
Except
bear. We don't.
koalas.
It's a paradise. We don't have bears. We don't have lions or tigers or any really dangerous animals. We have one spider called a caterpillar spider, which is poisonous and I think has never killed anybody ever. And we have wild pigs or boar in our deep forests, which again, no one's ever been killed by them. So for us, for there to be numerous sightings of big cats in New Zealand is very anomalous.
That is anomalous. Have any of them been shadow cats? Because I've received some reports of just a black three-dimensional shadow of a cat, and sometimes big, like the size of a panther, uh, with no features.
Little hard to say if that's true here or not. There have been sightings of large, like a black panther type cats here, but many of the sightings do appear to be like real animals, although how could that be? I even investigated one in about 20 miles away from my home. I was driving from Wellington City heading home and had the radio on and said, the Westpac rescue helicopter and a police helicopter are out looking for a big cat sighted near Tawa, which is a suburb of Wellington, not too far from me. And did I hear that right? Next day in the newspaper, there was a big article about it. I went around and interviewed the guy and examined the area. They had a huge area of wilderness and big open fields and things which went for miles and miles behind his house. But he had just got up in the morning on Saturday morning, was making a cup of coffee, looked out the window and saw what looked like a lion on a tree branch parallel to the ground, and the weight of it was weighing the branch down. And he freaked out, called the
Wow.
police because someone's got an illegal pet and it's escaped or whatever. Um, and ironically, he was in a charitable society called the Lions Society here, New Zealand. So at the next meeting, he got very mocked, made fun of by the other members of that group. But it was interesting because several other people in the area reported hearing the cries of a big cat at night. And there's a woman just down the end of the cul-de-sac street he lived in who she had a very tall brick wall around her place and there were big cat prints in her garden. So it was all weird and interesting, but no sheep or cattle or anything were killed or mutilated. And that was it. It was just a couple of days of this and then nothing. So I know Tony has a kind of has the viewpoint that there could be some sort of paranormal aspect to these animals, and Yowie type, Bigfoot type things, just because of the general weirdness of some of the sightings.
Yeah,
I'm keeping
certainly.
an open mind. It's very credible witnesses who, for one time in their life, they see a ghost or a UFO or a cryptid or whatever, um, very close up, and obviously couldn't be mistaken. And they really do not appear to be hoaxing. They often get ridicule and harassment and that afterwards, and even suffer PTSD type effects
Yes.
afterwards too. Um, those across the spectrum of all these strange events, those are things that really intrigue me. And the Eileen Moreland UFO sighting in 1959 is a good example of that.
Well, that is where I wanted to go next. This sounds like an incredible event. I'll just let you go with that. Start from the beginning.
Okay, so it happened in Blenheim in 1959. So that's in the South Island of New Zealand. Um, she lived on a small property, and they had a herd of about 20 cows. Her husband actually worked as a security guard at Woodburn Air Force Base nearby. And she got up in the morning because she would milk the small herd of cows each day, and a guy would drive around and collect milk from her and other people. Um, and she'd gone out to the milking shed, turned on the lights and the radio. There's a instrumental piano song by a chap called Russ Conway came on the radio. It was very popular at the time, um, and it was like in the top 10 or whatever at the time. And she distinctly remembered that being on the radio, and she liked the musical piece. Anyway, she went to go milk the cows, and then had definitely a close encounter type event happened, where a disc-shaped object with two rows counter-rotating of jets of fire coming out of it came down, hovered at an angle. There's a transparent dome in the middle with two what appeared to be men wearing silver suits and big helmets. It projected two beams of light, which are very green light, and the whole area was lit up with a green light. And it hovered with just a bit of noise, but not a lot. And then the noise level greatly increased for decibels and the frequency, and the thing shot off at high speed. Now, the cattle didn't seem to be too affected by this, which is unusual because animals often react to UFOs when they're near people who have sight of them. And she was pretty freaked out, of course. But anyway, in the ensuing Air Force investigation, at first she was reluctant to report it, but her husband said she should because she was a bit concerned about her husband's job at the Air Force Base. And she got a real grilling from the Air Force at the time. And she wasn't too pleased about their attitude, I think, and how they treated her. Anyway, it did leak out the news about it, and it was big publicity in the newspapers at the time. And she was interviewed afterwards and so on. And occasionally, years later, on the odd TV news thing of the anniversary, she would agree to an interview. But it's quite a complex situation. But basically, the Air Force had done a report on it. At first, they completely denied having any report on it. For many years into the 70s, they told any researchers who requested one that they didn't have anything. Then eventually they admitted they did have a file on her case, and eventually they released it. And then a few years back, we had a big dump of all the Defence Air New Zealand, New Zealand Defence Force files on UFOs were eventually all released. And that had a lot more information about her sighting in it. Now, supposedly, the Defence Force had released all their UFO files completely at that time. That is not true. a reporter from a South Island newspaper who was just working on something in his spare time. He was interested in her case, and he contacted me a couple of years ago. He wrote a big article about it, did a lot of research and uncovered some new stuff, and that's available online at the moment. It's called Finding Mrs. Moreland, and he did a really good job of it and investigated what the Air Force had investigated. Anyway, it turns out they still haven't actually released their entire file on her sighting. They've been lying because he discovered this. The Air Force is claiming, or Defence Force is claiming, that they had an agreement with her not to release the information. But anyway, it turns out this chap discovered, which I hadn't known, that she actually had a second sighting, nowhere near as dramatic, just of an odd light going across the sky sometime later. And although she had sworn, because of how she was treated, that she would never tell anyone if she ever saw anything again, she reluctantly did let the Air Force know, but had an agreement with them that they would never publicly acknowledge that sighting. It was just for their eyes only. So she had an agreement with the Air Force not to release this file on a much less dramatic sighting of a light in the sky, but there is no agreement with the Air Force not to release their file on her original very dramatic close encounter. And they have released, as I said, some of that, but apparently not all of it yet. So I'm going to be going through the process of trying to get access to that. I did originally put in a request for that when I wrote my book, The NZ Files, 22 years ago, but I dropped that request because I managed to track her down and interview her over the phone, which is quite elderly. And just a couple of interesting points about that she told me, which I didn't know when I wrote the book. One was the bit about the Russ Conway's piano instrumental. If it ever came on any time later when she's at a social gathering or party, she had to leave the room because it was like a PTSD thing. It brought the whole experience back to her and upset her. She couldn't bear to hear that music anymore. And another interesting thing, it was commonly reported that because she got red rash and marks on her face and hands and her fingers swelled up, it was often reported that she had to have her wedding ring cut off because her fingers swelled up. But she told me that wasn't true, that although her fingers and that did swell up, it wasn't to that extent. So she downplayed that and said that had been exaggerated by people. So I thought that was interesting as well.
So were the physical injuries consistent with exposure to radiation?
Potentially, or perhaps not nuclear radiation or that sort of thing, but perhaps, infrared, ultraviolet, that sort of thing, like the whole John Keel thing of people, getting burnt faces or irritated eyes and so on when they see a UFO close up, which is something they kind of reference near the beginning of the Close Encounters movie of the old guy and later on Roy Neary, the main character, be sort of sunburnt on one side of the face. So it was that sort of effect, and also some trees on the property. Again, it's hard to tell if it was a natural disease that was coincidental or related. They sort of died, and the centers of them were all disintegrated and so on. Now, this next one, speaking of damage to vegetation and so on, this is a really famous case in New Zealand from 1969 called the Aotearoa UFO circles. So Aotearoa, Ngatea, is a small town about an hour's drive south of Auckland, our biggest city in the North Island. And the sticks here mark 3 holes in the ground, which were there, and around them is a big area of burnt and crushed manuka brush, which is essentially like a UFO circle. And around this time, 1969 through to about 1972, we have multiple UFO circles like this, including one, a swirled circle of grass in the centre of a small pond on a farm, and the farmer actually said that he saw a UFO taking off from it. And that particular one is virtually identical to many swirled circles in swampland in Tully, Queensland, in northern Australia, northern Queensland, Australia. So again, it's kind of a bit like some of these other events. You sort of have a big wave of similar events happening within a fairly short time period.
Or in similar types of craft as well. And here they are leaving this swirl pattern in the grasses. And we've had a few of those in the United States as well, but they also seem to go in waves, only at certain times. It makes you wonder if there are different types of craft and different races of ETs visiting in a certain time that would leave that type of evidence.
Well, there's all sorts of theories and speculation. It's kind of very hard to tell because these kinds of markings, again, have gone back to way before 1947. And there are a large number of reports of very similar types of markings. You sort of have various other ones which are quite different in nature. It's a very complex thing. I mean, much like UFOs themselves, there are multiple types of UFOs reported, even in very close-up type sightings. And even if you discount 95% of reports roughly, which can be explained, satellites, planets, weather balloons, and all the rest of it, there's still quite a lot of variation in those sort of closer type sightings, close encounters, if you like. And there's various arguments back and forth about that. Mainly the French and Europeans, they have what they call the psychosocial hypothesis, where they basically say that it's people, pop culture and all that sort of thing influencing people. One idea which I find intriguing, and it ties in with balls of light, ball lightning type events, is being proposed by Jenny Randalls in England, that you can get an energy event like a ball of light or ball lightning type thing if you want to put a label on it. And people often have they call it the Oz factor. Time slows down or everything seems to stop.
Yes.
They black out and they wake up a period of time later, and they have this whole thing of a close encounter UFO type event. Now, she's proposed a potential idea. It's very hard to prove and it's very speculative, that there's some sort of natural energy event, which we might call ball lightning or whatever, and it's actually scrambled the person's brain when they've been knocked out. And it's generated this false memory, if you like, of a event with craft and entities and all that sort of thing, which to her mind would account for the variations and everything. I mean, it's an interesting idea, and there's a chap called Michael Persinger who's sort of proposed similar things with natural events and other phenomena as well as UFOs, but it's still very speculative. And look, I mean, I've been interested in this stuff since the early 70s. I don't have any answers. I probably have more questions than answers now after
that's how it goes.
Research, interviewing people, and so on. Because the UFO mystery is definitely the world's biggest and most complex and long-running mystery, and there are a lot of aspects to it. My gut feeling is that there is more than one type of event going on. That I wouldn't say UFOs are all spacecraft with aliens, or UFOs are all time travelers or interdimensional. They're all some unknown form of natural phenomena scrambling people's brains. I actually think there's potentially more than one explanation, if you like.
Do you have any fault lines in New Zealand?
Yes. We're
okay.
We
The
are a paradise, but we do have a few earthquakes. People have probably heard of the Christchurch earthquake,
yes,
which
yes.
caused a lot of damage. I grew up in Auckland for the first 25 years of my life, our biggest city towards the top of the North Island. But I moved to the bottom of the North Island, Wellington, which is the capital city, and is a lot smaller population-wise. And in Auckland, they don't have earthquakes. It is sitting on top of about 20 volcanoes, which are dormant, and hopefully none of them
Oh,
ever become active again.
right.
But because there's 1.5 million people there, but Wellington does have a lot of earthquakes. I've definitely felt earthquakes since I've been here. I'd never felt them before in Auckland ever, which is not to say it couldn't happen in Auckland, because unfortunately in Christchurch, they didn't realise there was a fault line where it was. And then they had a rather devastating earthquake in Christchurch. But yeah, New Zealand is very active with fault lines, earthquakes. We do have volcanoes, as I said. There's a couple of active ones in the middle of the North Island. And unfortunately, there was another disaster recently, White Island, which is a small island off the coast of the North Island, and some tourists from a cruise ship were visiting there, and there was a sudden eruption, and some people were killed and badly burnt as well. So we do have all that
Mm.
going on. We've got an area in the middle of the North Island called Aotearoa, which is very geothermically active with geysers and mud pools and all that sort of thing, and actually smells like the old rotten eggs thing. So if you go there on holiday, you get used to it after a couple of days. But yes,
Mm.
I think you're getting towards the idea of earth lights and
Yeah, the earthquake
balls of
lights
light
or
being associated
right.
with, and earthquake lights, which are another type of luminous phenomena being associated with that. And there have been reports tied in with earthquake events in New Zealand of earth lights, or balls of light. But having said that, even with balls of light, I think it's far more complex than that. I think what we tend to do is put labels on things. People say, "Oh, that's ball lightning." Well, what's ball lightning? It's probably about 20 scientific ideas of what ball lightning is and how it might work, but we don't really know. There are many reports of ball lightning supposedly, which are non you know storm conditions, and which are not
Peter, we're having a little sound issue. Um, would you try to unplug and plug in your headset one more time? Let's see what happens if that will fix
sure.
that. Okay, cannot hear you now. Oh, you're muted. Okay, let's try that.
Is that okay now?
Oh, much better. Okay.
The technology. Well, we're halfway around the world from each other.
Well, it's great when it works.
I'm living in Saturday morning, and you're living in Friday night.
That's right. Yes. What time is it there?
It's now 11:45 a.m. Saturday
Oh,
morning.
okay. So it's not too early.
No,
Yeah.
we started at 11 a.m. New Zealand time, or Aotearoa time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just saying, ball lightning. We call these things ball lightning, but there's a multitude of different descriptions of colors, sizes, behaviors, and so on. Even when it goes through a window, you have different types. One type will just go like a ghost through a window as though it's not there. And another type will melt a hole through, and another type will punch a hole through as though a baseball's gone through it. And I think the label ball lightning, a bit like the label UFO or UAP, is just put onto a whole range of potentially different phenomena or objects or whatever you want to call them. And part of that is context too. I always like to use an example. If someone sees a glowing entity, right? if they see it in an old house, they think it's a ghost, or perhaps in a graveyard or somewhere like that. But if they see it somewhere else, they might think, um, it's a UFO pilot or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They might even view it in a religious context. There are all sorts. I think people can see the same thing, and depending upon their upbringing, cultural background, and beliefs, and so on, they can interpret the same type of thing that's being seen in different ways. So I think we've got to be careful about labels. If someone says, I saw a ghost, or I saw, you know, this, that, or the other, try and put the label aside and sort of examine what they've reported actually seeing and see how it matches up with other things, perhaps some with different labels. Which
Yeah,
again is
I
why it's useful to look at a range of, if you're interested in UFOs, to look a little bit outside that.
so did you when you initially got interested in UFOs, did you then become interested in these other subjects, paranormal, cryptids, etc.?
Well, again, in the early 70s, my main interest was UFOs. Probably the main thing was, in terms of cryptids, was the Loch Ness Monster and a bit of Bigfoot and so on, and the Bermuda Triangle disappearances and everything. So those things all interested me at the time, UFOs the most. And UFOs have always interested me the most. But I do have quite a strong interest in the other areas as well. And because I read Charles Fort's 4 books, which were reprinted from the 1910s to late 1920s, that they first came out, and they were reprinted in the 70s because there's a lot of interest at the time in unusual events. And he just covers everything. I mean, he was ahead of everybody. He actually came up with the word poltergeist. Oh, sorry, not poltergeist, teleportation. He came up with the term teleportation. But he wrote about ghosts, poltergeists, teleporting people, UFOs, sea monsters, animal mutilations, everything. And he was well ahead of the curve on all these areas. And he said that everything was interconnected in some way, was his sort of idea. So I always sort of keep an open mind about that.
Right. Do you get any reports of crop circles in your area?
Well, really, the only thing was 1969 to around 1972 of Aotearoa circles and all that sort of stuff. And there have been just a handful of crop circles here in the last, since the whole crop circle thing started, the whole modern one. Um, my personal feeling is about the simple crop circles. I do believe they're genuine, but I think as it's morphed, you get a lot of hoaxes and art groups and people like that creating all these complex patterns. So, in my personal opinion, I don't think there's evidence of someone leaving a message or anything. Those ones, I think the simple crop circles, the original ones, and the swirl pattern ones, um, because that one in the pond and the ones which happen in the swamps in Tully in Queensland, Australia, they were very much like crop circles that are happening in wheat fields and things now. The vegetation crushed down by heavy weight and swirled
Mm-hmm.
in a circular pattern. Um, and as I said, in some cases, at least one in Queensland, Australia, and one here in New Zealand, a structured object UFO was seen taking off from one, allegedly, according to a witness. Although, and this is an explanation which I think is ridiculous. The Queensland case, the government said it was a tornado or a whirlwind that he saw, and I don't buy that. I think partly because I'm a Fortean, we're sort of partway between skeptics and believers, if you like. I weigh up the evidence on both sides, and I don't necessarily always make hard and fast judgments. But I have to say that there are many instances where skeptics have not impressed me with their explanations at all.
Oh, I totally agree with that. It seems like skeptics, without examining any of the evidence, say that's impossible, therefore it didn't happen.
Well,
Uh,
there's a term, armchair skeptics, so that people just sit on their bottom,
right.
um, never leave their home, and they just sort of pontificate from their armchair. So, I mean, as much as possible, I get out and interview witnesses and so forth, um, and do some proper research. And I mean, sometimes you do find an odd explanation for something. There's one interesting UFO sighting which I wrote about in my book, and it was an odd pattern of lights in the sky and everything. And potentially that could have sat in the unexplained file, but doing a bit of digging through newspapers and things at the time, I found there had been a big opening of an event, and I thought, I wonder if they had searchlights and weird things like that. Anyway, it turned out they had these special laser pattern-like things, which created a pattern exactly like what this couple had seen when they were driving and they were near the area. So that was obviously the explanation. And you really do have to weed out stuff like that, because there's no use leaving in hoaxes or cases which have an explanation, because you're gonna get further away from finding an answer to the truly unexplained stuff if you don't sort out what can be explained.
Hmm.
But as I said, having said that, the Kaikoura UFOs in 1979 are a classic example. So you had sightings by different groups of pilots on different plane flights between the South and North Islands. It was a cargo plane, and on a later flight on one of them, you had a TV crew that had gone on the plane just to film some footage of the flight and things and get interviews, and they actually caught film of the balls of light type UFOs, and that sort of went big internationally. Now, the skeptics came up with every possible explanation you could think of. They claim that these very experienced pilots who fly the same route day in, day out have mistaken the lights for cities and towns and trains and lighthouses on the coast, and refracted light from foreign squib boats which have bright lights, and stars and planets like Jupiter and Venus. They came up with all these explanations for what they had seen. And the explanations did not really fit the facts of what was reported. I also question that even if it was a particularly clear and warm night and there could have been bending of light rays and so on, why did this only ever occur 2 weeks in a row, never before or since all that time? Doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
It's a bit
right.
like with the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947, which kicked everything off. There are at least 8 explanations for his sighting. Now, maybe one of those explanations is correct. Maybe he greatly overestimated the speed and size of the formation of disc-shaped objects that he saw, which he described as moving like a saucer skipping across water, like if you throw a stone and it skips. Um, Maybe one of these explanations is correct, but there are at least 8 of them, and only one of them could be correct, even if one of them is. So the other 7 aren't. Sometimes it seems like skeptics will just throw anything that they can and hope that something sticks.
Yeah, just to convince people that the phenomenon isn't real. You mentioned cattle mutilations or animal mutilations earlier, and I'm wondering if you have very many in New Zealand, and if so, do you find a connection to that with UFOs?
Um, Not really. There's been a handful of cases. Um, some cases have been explained, and I'm not certain if this explanation is valid or not, as a dog that's attacked sheep repeatedly, and that kind of thing can happen. Um, we haven't had any really unusual cattle mutilations like some of the ones in America, which seem to be surgical precision and so on. Yeah, so I'm not really sure about that. The database is sort of way too small to. If there was anything possibly unusual going on, I might say that it was an animal like a big cat. But I certainly wouldn't
Okay.
bet my life on it or anything. And again, that's another interesting thing, like with the American cattle mutilations. You've kind of got three different big out of the box, if you like, explanations. If you think there's something unusual going on, one is that it's a secret government experiment. One is that it's being done by UFOs, aliens, and the other is that it's satanic cults. I've heard three very different explanations to explain something if it's the ones that aren't caused by normal animal predators. And again, it's one of those situations. I mean, who knows? But they can't all be right. Well, maybe they are, and there's all these different things going on. But I wouldn't bet on it.
Yeah. Can't believe that an hour has gone by. Want to make sure people know how to get a hold of your book.
Well, unfortunately, they can't. You can probably buy it secondhand. There's a few places online like eBay where it crops up occasionally, because it is 22 years ago, and my how time flies. I am working though. It's a very big job. I'm working on doing an updated version of this book. They're calling it the NZ Files, UFOs and USOs in New Zealand, because we do have lots of reports of mystery submarines and USOs in New Zealand waters, but also some companion books to go with it because of my other interests. So NZ Files, Ghosts and Poltergeists, NZ Files, Mowers and Monsters, and NZ Files, Forteana and Falls. So covering the whole gamut of unexplained events. And there is easily enough material to fill a big book.
How long do you think it'll be until that is released?
I'm not committing to a time frame yet.
No date?
No. Because again, partly unfortunately because of the online newspaper stuff, there's just so much material, older material, which I've uncovered, which I wasn't aware of before. Plus, we have ongoing things. New reports of things happen all the time. So yeah.
So sometime in the next 10 years. But when you do get it.
Okay, I'll put a time frame, couple of years, hopefully. Because also I've got to decide whether possibilities of. I like physical media, so I'd rather not just do ebooks, but also physical books as well. So there's a couple of small publishers here who I've got to sort of talk to. But I do have a website, and currently it just has about my stunt work and fight choreography and so on. But I'm not going to put a time frame on it, but I will be adding my stuff about my research and writing to that same site.
Okay, and what is that web address?
So it's stuntperformer.co.nz, and I'll probably pick up another URL, which will, when I broaden it, to pick up people that try and search for writing. But if people search Peter Hassall, Hassall, stunt or stunt performer, they'll find that site, and that site will certainly bring up the content about the writing and research when I get it done.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for taking time to be on the show today, Peter. We appreciate it. And will you come back sometime?
I'd be happy to come back sometime. I can certainly talk, and there's a lot of stuff to cover.
Yes.
It'd be interesting to see how I go with harassing the New Zealand government for the rest of the Eileen Moreland sighting info.
Keep me updated, and we'll have you back. I'm Margie Kay. This is UnX News Radio. Join me again next time.